And now to a deeply personal struggle that affects millions of people around the world, that is infertility. In America, one of Trump's campaign promises was to make fertility treatments more affordable for Americans, but little has been delivered. One young Democratic representative, Sara of California, is now leading the push to expand coverage of procedures like IVF. Michelle Martin asked her why she's focusing her initial efforts on providing this for U.S. service members.
Thanks, Christiane. Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I do want to focus on your bill, provisions that were in the defense bill that just passed. But before we get to that, what's the atmosphere on the Hill? It's just been a very, tumultuous doesn't really capture it, but it's been a really difficult couple of days. We're talking in the wake of the murder of the, controversial conservative activist Charlie Kirk. That stimulated, some feelings, in a lot of different institutions. And I just wondered, what's the atmosphere on the Hill right now?
Yeah, I'll be honest, it's really tense here. I have been here for 5 years now, which means my first week in office was January 6th, 2021. Right. And it really feels very similar to the time right after that, where members are distrustful of other members and their intentions. There's a lot of concern around safety for members, for our staff, and just a lot of vitriol being thrown around, censures being traded. And, it's a really difficult time to be here. And obviously that echoes the difficulty that the country is feeling right now.
I'm glad you mentioned January 6th because, one of the issues right now is political violence. That's obvious. I mean, it's obvious that Mr. Kirk was targeted because of public statements that he's made, and that, he was obviously a very kind of admired and even loved figure in some quarters, but in other people found him insensitive. Not polarizing, it doesn't even really capture that. Insensitive, some people found his comments kind of racist, sexist, etc. January 6th, this was an instance of political violence. I understand that people on the, I will say, liberal/progressive/democratic side feel aggrieved right now that there doesn't seem to be an appreciation of how traumatic that was for people. And I'm just wondering, how do you navigate this going forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult, right? I was in the House gallery on January 6th, trapped, literally introducing myself to my new colleagues, all hiding under a chair. Oh. And it was really scary. And my background is in actually working in post-conflict transitions and political violence at the State Department and the UN. And so I know one of the most important things we need in this moment is leadership to step up and say that violence is not okay. We can disagree, but we should never use violence as a tool to settle our political disagreements. And unfortunately, that's not what we're seeing right now. January 6th, but also, Melissa Hortman in Minnesota, right? This is an issue that's touched both sides, and it shouldn't be that hard for all of us to come together and say that in this country, we decide our political disagreements through the ballot box, not through the barrel of a gun.
But the administration, and just as the last question I have about this, the administration, the president, the vice president, a number of other conservative activists have been determined to make the argument that this is a problem of what they call the radical left. In the president's first public remarks about this, he didn't even mention the Minnesota lawmakers who were gunned down in their own home along with their spouses, one couple fatally, the other couple grievously wounded, but, survived. Didn't mention them. Didn't mention any of the Democrats who have been targets of political violence. And so given an environment like that, where you have the top political leadership of the country very determined to lay the blame at one side or the other, I just wonder how you, as a Democrat who's not part of that group, how do you face this moment without sort of feeding into the vitriol and this kind of pointing fingers?
Yeah, look, the data does not bear out what President Trump said, right? This is an issue that is happening to people on both sides of the aisle. And we are all Americans, and we should all be Americans first. And one of the core principles of our country is that we settle our differences through elections, not through violence.
So let's move on to a bill that, some provisions of the bill that you just got got passed, the annual defense bill, the House just passed the annual defense bill, you have provisions to expand fertility coverage for military families, requiring the U.S. military's health care program to cover treatments like IVF and egg freezing. So first of all, why did you consider this necessary, and why was this defense policy bill the right place to advance this legislation?
So we know that military families face higher levels of infertility than your average population, and it makes sense, right? We're asking them to be far away from their loved ones and do really dangerous things in their prime reproductive years. Right now, under TRICARE, the military insurance program, they can only get fertility treatments covered if they can prove a service connection to their infertility, which is really hard to do. And so I've heard from so many service members who basically were faced with three choices, like forgo building a family, pay tens of thousands of dollars out of pocket in order to do it, or leave the military to get a job in the private sector that has health insurance that covers this kind of treatment. And those are not three great options. And I am a 36-year-old woman, so these are the things I talk about with my friends all the time. I froze my eggs. I'm in the process actually of doing another round of freezing my eggs right now. And in talking publicly about that, I actually heard from service members who told me they wish they could do the same thing, but it wasn't available to them. And so, I think everyone should have access to the full range of fertility treatments covered by their insurance. But I think our military community is an important first step and could be a first step that could enable or push or incentivize private insurers to start covering this as well.
How do you explain to colleagues and constituents why access to fertility treatment in this more expansive definition, and not even if you can't directly tie it to military service, why that's important to supporting military families and supporting readiness?
Yeah, so look, we invest a lot of money in our service members training, right? Like millions and millions of dollars in training these folks. And it's really important for us to then be able to retain the best of them to move up the ranks. And if people are leaving the military because they can't build a family and need to make other choices, that's really bad for our readiness. And I think this will also be an important thing when we're doing recruitment, which numbers have been down, that this is an important incentive that people might be interested in joining the military in order to access.
So some people are going to look at this and say, well, that's why women shouldn't be in the military. So just for clarity's sake, this isn't just for women service members, right? This is for spouses of male service members so that they can preserve their fertility or their opportunity to have children while men are on these long deployments or are perhaps exposed to, elements that might compromise their fertility, correct?
That's exactly right. This is service members and their spouses.
You actually talked publicly about, you just said it, about freezing your eggs. Why did you talk about it? And why did you feel comfortable talking about it?
I mean, first of all, I think it's important to destigmatize these things, right? Like, this is what I talk about with my friends all the time. Who's having a baby, who's not having a baby, who's going through IVF, who can't afford childcare. And the idea that this should somehow be shameful, people often think about freezing your eggs as this sad thing, right? Like, oh, you're sold, you didn't find a partner. But in reality, I find it very empowering. I'm able to take agency in the decisions about my life. And what is a bigger decision than when and how to start a family? And also, I work in a body where it's our job to make laws for the whole country. And so many of my colleagues don't understand these technologies, have never heard of them. It's no secret that this is the third oldest Congress in history. And so, for me, another big part of it is that we're not going to make good policy if we're not talking about these issues. Because if my colleagues don't even know about them, we're not making policy about them. And this is an area where we need to be making good policy and expanding access.
So what was it like when you first surface this publicly with your colleagues? I know you said with your friends, you talk about this all the time, but what about with your colleagues? Did eyebrows raised or a little squeamishness? Oh, I don't know. Definitely all of that. There's also just, I think, a lot of dis and misinformation about fertility out there. So there's a lot of education that has to be done. Many of my colleagues don't really understand how
reproduction works, right? Like I had a Republican colleague who wanted to introduce a bill that banned abortion at 6 days, but you actually start counting pregnancy by your last period. So you're literally not even pregnant yet by 6 days. And so like, there's just so much mis and disinformation out there. And yet at the same time, women are feeling so pressured to build a family and have kids by this administration, by others. And, I think it's important that we talk about how that really works and what are the real policies we can do to help people who want to build their families.
It's my understanding that the administration is also considering banning abortion access at VA facilities. I don't know, is that also part of this bill, or can they do that by regulation or by executive order?
This bill only covers active duty service members, but we are working on other efforts to try and combat what they're doing at the VA.
So that isn't set in stone yet?
They can do it by executive order, but we're trying to push back.
Look, it's a conundrum in a way, because one argument might be, look, if on the one hand, you're saying you want to ban abortion because you think that that's wrong, but you won't encourage people to have families or support them in doing so. I don't know if those are related arguments or if you've even heard those linked in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And, they rolled back the policy that allowed service members to travel in order to get abortions if they were stationed in states that didn't have access to abortion. And so, no, I think it's a huge component of it. Like, it's why I spend so much time thinking about quality of life for our service members. I represent San Diego, the biggest military community in the country. And when you talk to service members, the things they want to talk to you about are like childcare, housing, healthcare, just like everyone else. But we have, like, these folks are serving our country. We have a responsibility to make sure that they can take care of their families too, not to mention that if they're worried about their families at home, or they're struggling to build their family or to afford it, or can't find childcare, like, they're not fully focused on the job we need them to do.
Well, in fact, there was a Blue Star Family Survey found that about 1 in 4 service members or their spouses report infertility. Can you just explain, what is it about military service that might make that uniquely true?
That's right. Look, the military population is more likely to be of reproductive age, so that increases just the number in general. But then if you think about like military service, it's during your prime reproductive years, right? The majority of people in the military are under 40 years old. And we're asking them, one, to be away from their loved ones during those years on long deployments. But also the things we're asking them to do are really dangerous, right? They're interacting with a lot of chemicals, with explosives, with other kinds of things. And also, in recent years, obviously also been sending them into literal war zones and conflicts. And so I think it makes a lot of sense that they then are having more of these struggles with fertility than the average population because of the things we're asking of them.
But, even President Trump, during his campaign for this term, called for making IVF, in vitro fertilization, more affordable. Do you see any evidence that there's a move in that direction?
We've not seen any evidence of that, although I'm still hopeful because I do think it's something that is really, really important. And while our bill that impacts military service members does not cover everyone, it still covers millions of people. And we have often seen that when TRICARE starts to cover something, private insurers tend to start to follow. And so we're hoping this could be one of those signals.
One of the things that distinguishes your tenure is sort of trying to find kind of nuanced approaches to difficult issues around fertility coverage, but also on another polarizing issue, Israel and Gaza. Like, you've supported Israel's right to defend itself, but you've also tried to speak up for humanitarian access, calling out atrocities. And I just have to wonder, are you kind of a caucus of one in that? Or do you feel like there are other people looking for that middle space? I mean, there have been these different groups over time, the Problem Solvers Caucus, the Blue Dog Democrats, people who saw themselves as people who were looking for these centrist positions. But do you feel that there's space for somebody like you?
I'm the youngest Jewish member of Congress. So, for me, the issues in Israel are very personal. I have family who lives in Tel Aviv. And in fact, my first cousin actually moved to San Diego after October 7th because she didn't want her kids to be in a bomb shelter every night. At my cousins, my aunt and uncle still send me pictures of themselves in the bomb shelter, many nights. And then I also think about the families in Gaza who don't even have bomb shelters to go to. And I've been all over Israel many times. I've been to Gaza, I've been to the West Bank. For me, I think it's maybe because of that easier to see the humanity on both sides. But I actually think that my position is what the majority of Americans feel, that October 7th was really bad, that Israel has a right to defend itself, but also what we're seeing in Gaza right now is horrific and terrible and should be stopped. And that's particularly true of young Jews. And so, I think it's often hard here in Congress to find a nuanced position, right? Everyone wants you to pick a side. But I actually think that most of my colleagues and most of the American people are actually where I am. And I just have the personal story to be able to talk about it a little bit more loudly.
And as we are speaking now, another possible government shutdown because of an inability to pass a budget on time, an inability to return to what's called regular order, which means just doing what we all learned about in fifth grade, which is, committees meet, they talk about the budget, both sides pass it, president signs it, they work out their differences in committee. That's not happening for the most part. So
look, I don't know if we're going to end up in a government shutdown. I myself don't think I can vote for a continuing resolution that doesn't include protecting people's health care that we know is being gutted with their cuts to Medicaid, not to mention the things they put into this actual continuing resolution. And so, those conversations are ongoing, but I think it's unfortunate that basically in my whole time in Congress, we've had to get to this point where it's a crisis before we can get a negotiation. And I think that it's, I think what the American people want is to know that we can get things done. And that's what I'm trying to show here.
Are you still glad you came to Congress? You've served in public service before in other areas, but are you still glad you're sitting in that chair?
Most days, yes. Some days, no. But it is truly my honor to get to represent my community during this really difficult time. I never thought my background would be quite so relevant to what we're experiencing here in the United States. But I also know that, if I wasn't in a position to try and make things better, I would actually feel worse. So even on the hardest days, I remember to be grateful for the opportunity I have to try and fix things.
Congresswoman Sara Jacobs, thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thanks for having me.
Now to the crackdown on history itself, from removing museum exhibits on American slavery to paintings over Washington, D.C.'s Black Lives Matter mural. Scholars and activists say Trump's DEI purge is minimizing and even erasing Black history. And our next guest is acutely aware of the impact. Monroe Nichols is mayor of Tulsa, Oklahoma. His new initiative, Road to Repair, would grant the city's Black community over $100 million to address harms caused by the Tulsa race massacre of 1921. And Mayor Nichols joins Michelle Martin to discuss the importance of confronting the country's past.
Thanks, Christiane. Mayor Nichols, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely.
So before we get into the details of the project that you're trying to, the effort that you're making in Tulsa, I just wanted to kind of take you back a little bit. You were actually born in Waco, Texas. Yeah. You moved to Oklahoma to go to college and also to play football, but mainly to go to college.
Right.
I just wanted to ask you if you remember when you heard about the Tulsa Race Massacre, because this was an historical event that for some people, clearly not for survivors and the people who lived through it, but for many people had been kind of lost to history. Will you tell people who may not have heard of this what happened? And I'm particularly interested in what you first heard had happened versus what you learned later.
Yeah, I mean, what I first heard had happened is just that there's this riot in Tulsa where Black Wall Street was destroyed. That was like the basis of the knowledge, right? And so I didn't have much beyond that. But for the people who are watching, what existed in Tulsa at one time was an entrepreneurial center. It was almost like a city within a city where you had movie theaters and grocery stores and doctors' offices and attorneys' offices and schools and churches that all thrived in what was a very segregated society here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Greenwood District would become known as Black Wall Street because of all the commerce in and out of this part of our community. On May 31st and June 1st, a 24-hour period saw a massacre that saw a white mob come to Greenwood and burn to the ground about 37 blocks, about 1,200 Black businesses and homes, and left thousands of people homeless and some even put into camps. The death toll is believed to be over 300, although only reported as 36 at the time by local officials. And it is the only documented aerial assault on an American city in our nation's history. So it was a massacre of epic proportions, and it destroyed what was perhaps the greatest example of Black excellence in economics and entrepreneurship that the country had seen at the time, and that's what happened in that 24-hour period from May 31st to June 1st.
The only sort of minor edit I would make to that is people may remember that there was a neighborhood in Philadelphia that was also bombed by government officials. There was a sort of a Black radical group that had kind of taken up residence there, but that is also seen as a modern atrocity. But here's the other thing: you said you had initially heard of this as a riot. And it has now been known as a massacre. And there's a real reason that matters. Could you just explain why that matters so much? Then it's not just a matter of words, that the nomenclature is not just a matter of which word. It has real force.
Absolutely. It has real force. And it was in some ways a matter of legality. A riot meant that it was easier to deny insurance claims for folks who had lost homes and businesses. And honestly had a lot of people escape any level of culpability. To this day, not one person went to jail because of, their involvement. Until this day, not one government has repaid back to help rebuild in ways that were directly associated with bringing back what was lost. There were promises made to do that even directly after the massacre. Did not happen. So naming it a riot all these years meant that there's a lot of people who got to escape culpability, both on the individual side and the public institutional side. And it wasn't until, more about this came out that it was clear this was not a riot. This was a slaughtering of a people, because we now know the numbers. We now know what was lost. We know now what was refused to be restored, for example. It was certainly a massacre of epic proportions. And to your point about Philadelphia and other places, I think the other great thing about uncovering our history is that we know about other places where things like this happen, maybe not at the same scale where you have 300 dead, but Wilmington, North Carolina is another example of a place where this stuff happened. And I think it's important that as we consider what we're doing with the Greenwood Trust, that we find good models for how you begin to mitigate the harm, because it exists. The legacy of the massacre is very palpable in Tulsa. It doesn't mean that people don't like each other and we have that, but there's this subtleness about it that still has this community kind of held by the chains of division in ways that just prevent you from uniting in the way that you need to unite to meet the other big challenges that we face, that everybody faces together. And so I do think it's really important, even in this moment in our nation's history, that we're very honest about the road that it's taken to get here, and that we find ways to mitigate harm, because that's the only way that I think we can appropriately move forward.
So let's bring up to the present moment. There was a lot of attention paid to the Tulsa Race Massacre on the centennial of it back in 2021, which acknowledged the 100 years after. There are still some people who survived, who were obviously very small children, at the time. There was a lot of energy around trying to figure out, what to do. But not a lot really happened. I mean, there were negotiations around some kind of recompense. Didn't happen. Now we're 3 years later, and you've announced a major initiative to kind of, I don't know, maybe I'll let you describe it because it's a very comprehensive project. What is it that you have in mind?
Yeah. So just for a little bit of context, you mentioned the centennial back in 2021, and going all the way back to 2001, there was a state commission that recommended certain things the state should do to address the harm caused by the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Since then, we've had a commission of Beyond the Apology Commission that was created by my predecessor to come up with recommendations. We have advocacy groups like Justice for Greenwood and the Deep Greenwood Foundation. Where I arrived at was the creation of the Greenwood Trust, a private charitable trust that I'm going to be going out and raising capital for $105 million, reflective of the very specific $24 million recommendation from the Beyond the Apology Commission, which is made up of descendants around housing and home ownership, a $60 million fund investing directly into cultural landmarks and the surviving entities from the massacre. There are some buildings that still stand. So making sure that we're investing in those because they're not always in the best condition for all the reasons that we know that happens over time. And then also invest in the future by investing in college scholarships and business grants and no interest loans to businesses that are owned by descendants so that in the end, not only are we mitigating harm, but we're ensuring that we can begin to have those same families, those descendants, rebuild the district back to where it was.
So there's a couple of things here. This really depends on raising a lot of private money. You really think you can do it?
Absolutely. I think we can do it. You know, we've had some conversations up here. We're spending a year really planning to set the programs to, appoint trustees, a board of directors that'll be national and local. And then we're also evaluating what public assets we have that the trust can be a beneficiary of. So there's parts of the Greenwood district that the city owns land in. And as we develop, the proceeds from those developments can go back into the trust. I think there's two things that you have to balance when you think about the political realities of where you're at. So you got one school of folks who say, well, the massacre was a long time ago. I didn't do anything wrong. Why should I have to pay for it? Right? You got that going. Then you got some people even on the other side who said, well, 104 years later, we really need direct cash payment. So you're balancing these two things. And so the thought is, what do we have in the way of assets that when developed can produce to feed into the trust? So there's obviously some skin in the game from the public side. But the idea is if we can create the kind of economic activity with those assets, with private capital, we can get to a space where those folks who are the school of thought who believe that they shouldn't pay, understood. That's fine. We don't have to fight about that. We're going to make investments. We're going to do it both privately and we're going to do it through the way of using some public assets.
So you were first elected in 2024. As I understand, you just took office in 2024.
Just took office in December.
And I want to say you're also the first Black mayor,
right,
of Tulsa. And is that why you ran, in part to achieve something like this, to create this kind of energy around it?
It actually wasn't. I mean, I ran, so our city is dealing with a number of challenges. I ran on ending homelessness in 6 years, improving student outcomes, expanding our economy, making Tulsa the safest big city in the country, and working with tribal nations. Tulsa is also the largest city in the country that's all Indian reservation. That was my focus during the campaign. But about 10 days after I got elected, all these recommendations on how you mitigate harm hit your desk. And you have a decision to make. Are you going to ignore them? Are you going to put them aside and say these things aren't possible? Or are you going to lean into it? And my sense is that the four things that I mentioned for the reasons that I ran for mayor, I don't think they're possible unless you do this. Communities who are divided or who have this unresolved trauma have a hard time meeting the need on all these other big challenges that we have. I think we see this all across the country. So the Greenwood Trust, although very much focused on the descendant community and mitigating harm, I think it's critical to meeting all those other goals, which are the reasons I ran for office.
In fact, you said that in the speech that you gave announcing the trust or your sort of plans for the trust, you said there is not one Tulsan, regardless of their skin color, who wouldn't be better off today had the massacre not happened, or if generations before had done the work to restore what was lost. Will you say more about that?
I think we would have been the exception to some of those things you see all across the country. Not every place had a Greenwood district, right? Not every place had that kind of example at that kind of scale of where folks had beaten the odds, even in a segregated society. So imagine if that had gone uninterrupted, what it would look like today. Imagine the number of African Americans all across this country now who have some origins of Tulsa who would have stayed here, but who left after the massacre. Imagine all those who would have been drawn here because of the economic vitality of this community. And imagine what it would have meant for our city's economy overall. We would have been in some ways the exception of a lot of places all across the country. And so I say because of the massacre, because we had the Greenwood District, it certainly should reinforce to us that our problems from an economic standpoint were man-made, brought on by the massacre in a lot of ways, right? We had the opportunity to close the wealth gap had the massacre never happened. We had the opportunity to close the achievement gap had the massacre never happened. And we traded that. We traded that opportunity to be that shining example of how a city can thrive for everybody on May 31st and June 1st of 1921. And I still do believe it, that there's not one person in the city who wouldn't be better off had that not happened.
Well, it's interesting because the pretext for the massacre was, like so many other instances of violence directed at Black people, was an incident where it was alleged that, a white woman was mistreated. Okay. But in the sort of the light of history, the argument has subsequently, some people would argue that the reason that this violence took on this kind of vicious mass quality was jealousy. It was economic jealousy, that there was a certain cohort of people who couldn't tolerate the fact that Black people in Greenwood were as successful as they were. Those folks have descendants too. And so the question becomes, do you think you can persuade those descendants that all these years later, even they will be better off if these initiatives take place?
Oh, absolutely. I think I would tell the folks who descend from those families who were more the perpetrator side of the massacre, that they would have benefited a great deal. They wouldn't have the legacy of something so horrible as a stain on their family's history. They could talk about openly their family's history with pride. And I think that's something that was also taken from those families. And so I believe that Tulsa's a much different place. I know Tulsa's a much different place in 2025 than it was in 1921. And I think that's the message right now, right? Like, we are not that far removed from the massacre in a lot of ways. There's still two survivors that live today. I just visited Mother Fletcher and Mother Randall last Wednesday. Mother Fletcher is very sharp. She's 111 years old, but she is here. Sometimes I think we think about history when you see black and white pictures and you think, oh my goodness, that was such a long time ago. It wasn't that long ago, right? When we think about the overarching kind of context of history. And so, I would absolutely tell those folks, they more so than almost anybody would be better off had the massacre not happened. But I think it also should reinforce in them this need to do something about it, right? I think when I think about restoration and righteousness, it's also about getting right with that family history that those folks might have. I don't blame them no more than I blame anybody else. So it's not a question of blame, but it is a question of courage. Do we have the courage to do something that's difficult to do at a time where it's difficult to do it? Do we have the courage to cross the train tracks and talk about the lived experience of our neighbors in a way that we haven't done before? Because I think when you do that, it makes the Greenwood Trust a very easy sell, right? When you just begin to bind those own wounds, it makes stuff incredibly easy.
Mayor, before we let you go, this initiative arrives at a really interesting time when some people would call this a backlash moment to these kinds of initiatives. Do you see headwinds at this point?
Significant headwinds, but so much of that is less about the national context, because we've had times where one could argue it would have been a better time to have a conversation like this, but it didn't happen then either. So there's never really a right time that we found in 104 years to have this conversation. So I think you just got to meet it with a whole lot of honesty and transparency and not be afraid to talk about it in certain spaces. Again, and I said this in the speech last Sunday, this is not an effort to assign blame. This is an effort to address the harm caused by an event that is a historical fact. And that's the reason why we released the 45,000 pages of unreleased documents that we're sitting on. That's why we continue the Graves investigation, because families deserve closure. And I think everybody can understand that. This is not about going and saying, oh, look how evil certain people are in this community. It's just like, no, people just need closure to know what happened to their loved one. Even in a moment like this, think about the opportunity for us. While everybody's having a bunch of different conversation about race, imagine if Tulsa, all of us came together and we made this happen. Just like I said, we would have been an outlier had the Greenwood district remained uninterrupted. We would also be an outlier nationally of how people who are all political strides, all different races are coming together saying this is in our value set and we're going to do what we can, even with the constraints that we have, to make these investments. It actually helps us stand out in ways that I want Tulsa to stand out. This gives us the opportunity to make sure that June 1st wasn't the end of the story. We get to write new chapters on it in a way that I think we provide the rest of the country with a pathway with how you can engage these kind of conversations. I think that's an important contribution to make, but it's also about us getting right with ourselves and making sure we can move this community forward as one big united city. And so if we have to take a look back 104 years to think about how we go forward tomorrow, that's an investment of time and effort that's well worth it.
Mr. Mayor, Monroe Nichols IV, the mayor of Tulsa, thank you so much for speaking with us. I do hope we'll speak again. I'd love to hear how it's going.
I can't wait to do that.
In the United States, as some immigrant families fear the Trump administration's ICE crackdown, they are taking the painful decision to leave the United States, even if it means separating from their families. One such case is that of Se Jun Park, a U.S. Army veteran recently forced to self-deport back to South Korea over decades-old drug charges that were linked to PTSD that he suffered. The Purple Heart recipient and his attorney, Danny Cole Ramos, joined Michelle Martin to share his story of leaving behind the only country he's ever called home.
Thanks, Christiane. Se Jun Park, Danny Cole Ramos, thank you both so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Mr. Park, I'm going to start with you. You came to the United States by yourself when you were so young. So as briefly as you can, would you just tell us what brought you to the United States at such a young age and alone?
My mom came to the United States when I was 6, and I was living with my father at the time. So he read me a letter from my mom and asked me if I want to go live with my mom. So at that time, as a young child, I made that choice to go live with my mom. So he set up everything. They put a little tag on me, and then I got on a plane by myself and got escorted from Korea to Hawaii, Hawaii to LA, LA to Dallas, and Dallas to Miami. That's where I reunited with my mom at 7 years old. Yes.
At one point, you enlisted in the Army. You went into combat in Panama during the U.S. military action in Panama. You were only 19 years old. I understand that you were shot. You were actually shot in the spine.
Yes. Well, I turned 20 in basic training. So when I joined at 19, and then during the war, I was 20 years old, early 20. It was a second day patrolling around. I got shot twice in the back. One was in the spine and the other one left lower back, and it went in my body, tumbling around, dodging all my vital organs, the lung, the liver, the heart. If I take an x-ray, I light up like a Christmas tree. I still have little shrapnels left inside my body. And I was very fortunate and lucky.
Well, I'm very glad that you're here with us to tell us the story. But you received the Purple Heart, which is acknowledging that you were wounded in action, and you were honorably discharged. You were honorably discharged. It's my understanding, though, that you struggled after you left the service. Why do you think that is? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
At the time, there was no such thing as PTSD, but I didn't know what it was. I had nightmares almost every night. I couldn't sleep. I had nightmares. I'd get cold sweats out of nowhere. I couldn't watch war movies. I couldn't hear loud sounds. Like at the time in LA, there was a lot of gunfire going on every night. You could hear the gunshots. So every time I would hear a gunshot, I would get nervous and start acting out. I couldn't tell anybody what I was going through because, once again, there was no such thing as PTSD. And like being a male, I was supposed to be a tough guy. So I didn't want to go crying to anyone of what I was feeling. So I really had to deal with everything on my own.
Well, just forgive me, with respect, there was such a thing as PTSD that apparently there just was no language for it then. Do you think that you started self-medicating? as a consequence of that?
Well, I definitely feel that way because marijuana helped. Marijuana helped me go to sleep without dreaming because I had nightmares all the time. And I found a way, if I smoked weed, that I wouldn't get nightmares and I would actually get to sleep at night. So that's what kind of started off. Eventually, it led to harder drugs. So eventually, I started doing crack cocaine, and which pretty much took control of my life at such a young age. And that's where the final, when I did get arrested, it was possession of crack cocaine. Yes.
And also, is my understanding bail jumping or not meeting a required court appearance, is that accurate?
Yes. Well, the judge gave me a few chances. So she told me one time, like, Mr. Park, next time you come into my courtroom with the dirty urine, you will be sent to prison. Oh. So me being scared and nervous, that happened in New York. So I got in my car, and from New York, I drove to LA, and then from LA, got on a plane and went to Hawaii.
Oh my, okay.
A year and a half later, the U.S. Marshals came looking for me, and then I turned myself in once I found out they were looking for me.
You did serve time in prison. You then did have many, many years of sobriety. You raised a family. It's my understanding that how else can I put it? You have fulfilled your obligations to the country. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, I lived with that addiction for many years. So when I went to prison, when people say when you hit rock bottom, it's easy to quit. Literally, when I went sent to prison, that was my rock bottom. I started praying every night, losing my kids, losing my family, not knowing how long I'm going to be gone for. So that really helped me kick the drug habit cold turkey. It was not hard after that. And then when I did get released, I wanted to catch up my time with my children and live a good life, and which I have been doing, checking with ICE or immigration officers every year. At first, it was once a month, and then once every 3 months, and then once every 6 months. And eventually, since I was doing good, they put it to once every year. And that's how I've been living for the past 14 years, over 14 years.
So here's where I want to turn to your attorney, Danny Cole Ramos. It's my understanding that that Mr. Park did have a removal order. Would that be as a consequence of this drug conviction? Would that have been that?
Yeah, so for Mr. Park's situation, he had a removal order based on 2 convictions that happened in New York that he mentioned. So one was the possession of the controlled substance, and then the other was jumping bail when he missed that that drug testing date mandated by his judge. So those 2 convictions alone were what Immigration and Customs Enforcement used to insert a removal order on him. Now, the thing that was the most serious out of the 2 convictions were his bail jumping. And in immigration law, bail jumping is considered an aggravated felony. And for aggravated felonies in immigration law, they're very serious crimes. They're considered convictions that have no potential relief from deportation, and it can possibly permanently bar you from naturalizing as a U.S. citizen. We can think of them as like murder. We can think of them as rape. We can think of them as robbery or trafficking drugs or human trafficking. It seems surreal that jumping bail is considered an aggravated felony, almost the equivalent of murder, rape, robbery, dealing drugs. And so because of that bail jumping conviction that he had in New York, that was the reason that he was barred from any relief or cancellation from removal. And that's why that removal order was reinstated in 2010.
Mr. Park had a removal order, but he's lived in this country for all this time. So he had a removal order for 14 years and then nothing happened. So then what happened? Yeah,
so when he first got his removal order, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, has discretion to enforce which removal orders they want to do. And so what then they decided to work on was, hey, Mr. Park, you do have a removal order, you did do these convictions, but we're going to put you on something called deferred action. And deferred action is what ICE uses as their discretion to say, hey, you do have a deportation order, we can remove you, but considering Mr. Park's background as a Purple Heart veteran, they decided that he wouldn't be considered a priority for deportation. They would just let him live his life, but with certain restrictions, as he mentioned, right? So with it, checking in with ICE on a regular basis, making sure that he stays clean and sober, And then he does have work authorization. So he's still allowed to work. He had to pay about thousands of dollars a year to renew that work permit. But he was able to live his life so long as he had no criminal record and stayed clean and sober.
So then what happened? I mean, so last month, what happened last month?
Yeah. So for Mr. Park, he was warned at his last check-in back in May of 2024 that if President Trump returns to office, there's a strong chance that he would get his deferred action taken away and that the removal order back in 2010 would be enforced. We go back in June last month to check in with the ICE officer. And the ICE officer said, and I remember vividly what he told me and staging was like, because of this new administration, because of this new regime, that we're going to have to take away your deferred action. And the ICE officer did say to him that, I could detain you right now. But what we worked out with the ICE officer is like, hey, that doesn't look good that you're going to detain him right now because his whole family is here waiting for him at his ICE check-in. So what we agreed to do is that Mr. Park would self-deport, put on an ankle monitor until then, and have an itinerary to leave the United States by the end of the month.
Mr. Park, can I just ask what went through your mind when you heard this?
That night when I went home, I think it was my PTSD acting. I had a hard time sleeping that night because knowing that I could have been detained and I could have been in a jail cell instead of me being at home, it did a lot to me, and it was surreal. I had 3 weeks to remove myself. My children, my parents, they're old. And my aunt and uncle, they're all old, and I've been kind of taking care of them. So processing everything was really tough. I just couldn't believe that it was actually happening. I haven't been to Korea in over 30 years, like 30 years, literally. So it's like going back to a country that I have no idea about. So it was really tough, and a lot was going through my mind all the way through to the day I got on that plane.
You almost made the ultimate sacrifice. I mean, you took two bullets, a bullet in the spine for the United States. And so I'm just curious, if you don't mind my asking, why you never applied for citizenship?
I've been asked that a lot. You have to understand, like, I came when I was 7 years old, legal resident with the green card through my mother and everything. I always thought I was almost equivalent as a citizen. I never joined the military to get a citizen. It wasn't like that. I always felt like I am an American because I came here so early, and with the legal green card, I thought I can just live in the United States like a normal citizen person. And then I had other priorities. I was still young and just never thought getting a citizenship was on the top of my priority because I thought I was an American. I served for the country, and I just thought it was normal and legal for me to just live in the United States with a green card. I really felt that way. Obviously, I was wrong.
There are those who would argue that a person who breaks the law, especially a felony, achieving citizenship through naturalization is a privilege, not a right, and that you forfeit that right by breaking the law. For someone who felt that 100%. Way, what would you say?
No, I made mistakes. Exactly. I had a drug addiction. It wasn't like a violent crime. I wasn't hurting other people. I was hurting myself. Now I realized it was mostly due to my PTSD and other problems I had. But I never denied that fact that, yes, I did break the law. I wasn't in a right, clear mental state. Even with my kids and everything, it was tough. It was tough living that life as an addicted person, trying to make it through every day with the struggle of being a drug addict. So I totally understand when people say that about me because that's who I was at the time, struggling with drugs.
So we did reach out to ICE about why your deferred action was revoked after more than a decade of compliance, as Mr. Ramos just laid out. And this is what the agency said in a statement. They said Sejun Park's extensive criminal history includes convictions for possessing, manufacturing, or selling a dangerous weapon, carrying a loaded firearm in a public place, assault, and criminal possession of a controlled substance. In 2010, an immigration judge issued him an order of removal. Park's appeal to the Board of Immigration Appeals that same month was dismissed by the board in April 2011. With no legal basis to remain in the U.S. and a final order of removal, Park was allowed to self-deport to Korea. President Trump and Secretary Noem have been clear. Criminal illegal aliens are not welcome in the U.S. If you come to our country and break our laws, we will find you, arrest you, and deport you. That's a promise. So that's what they have to say about that. So can I hear from each of you about how you respond to that?
I don't know where they came up with the manufacturing weapon, because I've never done that. I've never manufactured no dangerous weapon like that. Yes, I have been arrested with the possession of a gun. The reason we moved to Hawaii from LA was we're the victims of, our family is the LA riots. Our store burnt down during the LA riots, got looted. And at that time, early 90s, just from going to work in South Central LA, I would always carry a gun. I didn't have a permit for it or anything like that, but it was for safety. And one day I got pulled over and I had a concealed weapon on me. That's where that gun charge came from. And then the firing was, I was celebrating me joining the Army on top of with a couple of friends, shooting up in the air. The firearm, possession of gun, those two are real, but I never manufactured no guns or solicit drugs. I don't know where they got that from, because that wasn't what I did. That was not part of that.
Mr. Ramos, what do you have to say about that? You heard the ICE statement. What would you say to that?
Yeah, so first of all, I'll say Mr. Park was never what they quoted as a criminal illegal alien. He came here legally as a green card holder. So I just want to get that record straight. And then the second part I want to respond to with that comment with DHS is, how does deporting someone like Mr. Park, a Purple Heart veteran who served this country, took 2 bullets for this country, and despite his past mistakes, was able to turn his life around, redeem himself, raise 2 kids, have a job, and then while at the same time take care of his elderly mother who's facing early onset stages of dementia. How does deporting him make this country safer? When I think about Mr. Park's situation, right, there's a lot of veterans like him who have gone through what he's gone through, suffered PTSD from a deployment. They also went through some drug addiction, and like Mr. Park, they overcome it, and they get support to overcome it. The difference between them and Mr. Park is that Mr. Park has this immigration status of his that affects his ability to stay in the United States, and punishes him for past mistakes, even though he showed that he's redeemed himself. And I think in every aspect of Mr. Park, besides paper, he is an American. Every sense of him, every part of his story is American. I think there's so many parts of it that I think people across the country can resonate with.
So, Mr. Park, what was it like to go back to Korea after not having lived there for so many years? Do you even speak Korean anymore?
Luckily I do, because my mom, I take care of her. She speaks fluently Korean. So at home, luckily I did keep that part. I can't read or write, and I guess it's broken Korean. It's not like I speak it perfectly, but enough to get by. It's overwhelming. The first 3-4 days, I couldn't stop crying for hours every morning, just everything sinking in. And I think my PTSD was acting up a little more. Feel ashamed, like to being like kicked out of the country, coming back to a country I haven't been. So it has been really tough. Tomorrow will be exactly 1 month since I've been here. It's been a long month. So I'm doing my best. I'm still hopeful maybe one day I can make it back to my family, my real family in Hawaii.
So, Mr. Ramos, before we let you go, does Mr. Park have any recourse?
Yes, he does. We're looking at all these legal options, and I've expressed this to Mr. Park before. It's going to be a long process and a long shot. So the main thing that we're working on right now is we sent in a request a month ago to the Queens District Attorney's Office to replead those 2 convictions that caused his deportation order in the first place. So it's the possession of the controlled substance and then the jumping bail. There's been new law in 2023 from the Second Circuit that makes his possession of a controlled substance no longer a removable offense. However, he still has this bail jumping conviction, which is the aggravated felony that barred him from any kind of relief or cancellation of removal. So what we sent in a request with to the District Attorney's Office in Queens is that asking if they would be willing to negotiate with us to at least take that bail jumping from a felony and drop it down from a misdemeanor. If it's dropped down to a misdemeanor, at least a misdemeanor, it allows us some opportunity to reopen his removal order in immigration court, request the court to then vacate it. And then if all those convictions are vacated, and the removal order is vacated, then there's possibly a pathway for him to come back to the United States.
Sejun Park, Danico Ramos, thank you both so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, the British government is launching a formal investigation into the social media platform X after the site's AI chatbot, Grok, was being used to generate and spread non-consensual sexual images of women and children. Despite extensive backlash to the abusive imagery, Elon Musk and President Trump have claimed that any attempts to regulate the site would be an attack on free speech. Our next guest, the Atlantic staff writer Charles Warzel, tells Hari Srinivasan why Elon Musk cannot keep getting away with this.
Christian, thanks. Charlie Warzel, thanks so much for joining us. You wrote a piece recently in The Atlantic, and you said Elon Musk cannot get away with this. If there is no red line around AI-generated sex abuse, then no line exists. And I wonder, what got you so upset about this? You've been somebody who's covered technology companies and trends for years. Why does this feel different?
Well, I think in some ways it's very self-explanatory, right? This chatbot Grok, which is hooked into Elon Musk's X, it's built by XAI, his AI company that is also integrated with formerly Twitter, now X. It started to generate these images of people in bikinis or people in cellophane bikinis, so it was see-through, etc. People then started putting. Asking the chatbot to put pictures of, seemingly children in there. And it started to become this tool that was, hooked into this social network, and it was used to viralize and weaponize this type of harassment. We've seen this since the arrival of generative AI. We've seen that there is a problem with these undressing apps, right? With people taking photos of people and putting them in these compromising situations against their will. We've also seen problems with trolling and a lack of content moderation on platforms like X under Elon Musk, and even on Facebook and other places. We've seen message boards like 4chan that have these awful people on them who just want to cause chaos, who just want to hurt people, who just want to troll. What happened on X from I think it was around December 30th to very recently was the combination of all these things. It was like taking 4chan and hooking it up to a popular social network that, politicians, celebrities, brands, maybe I used to post on this network. And it was being used to intimidate and harass at scale. It basically turned child sex abuse material and just normal, not really revenge porn style sexual abuse into a meme. And that was something I think was unprecedented.
I want to read a statement that Grok, or X's safety team, they posted. It said, quote, "We have implemented technological measures to prevent the Grok account on X globally from allowing the editing of images of real people and revealing clothing such as bikinis. This restriction applies to all users, including paid subscribers. Additionally, we'll geo-block in jurisdictions where such content is illegal. The ability of all users in those locations to generate images of real people in bikinis, underwear, and similar attire in Grok on X." So are the measures that they're taking sufficient? Do you see any evidence that it's actually happening and restricting any of this type of material from existing?
I think that the measures are beginning to be sufficient, or more sufficient. It happened it happened basically over a series of steps, right? At first, X decided that it was going to disable the ability for image generation for people to basically prompt the chatbot, right? This was the weaponized, viralized thing. Grok put her in a bikini. It disabled that, which sort of added one small layer of friction.
Yeah.
Then the platform said, okay, we're going to make image generation a paid feature. That in itself was somewhat disturbing because then it essentially makes, non-consensual AI-generated revenge porn a paid feature on the platform. After, I'd say, 3 or 4 days of more and more pressure and outrage, finally they took these restrictions. There are now many, many fewer instances. I have not really been able to find instances of this being abused in the way that it was. But if you go to other forums, right, there are Reddit pages. There are other, I won't, describe where they are, in other corners of the internet. You see people trying as a group to jailbreak Grok and these image generators, trying to get around all those guardrails and trying to figure out the best way to prompt, a chatbot to put someone in these types of compromising situations. So I think that the problem has been addressed for now, but it took basically 2 weeks of some of the most heinous stuff that I have seen on the internet as a product feature for this company to act.
And one of your concerns is that while this might have happened in the backwaters of the internet, this was right in the kind of the main bloodstream here, and this just weaponized the scale of how fast this information could spread. Am I right?
Yeah, it becomes a meme and it becomes a culture, right? There's always been a problem with women and vulnerable people being harassed on X and across social media and all kinds of places. And some of that is just the chaos of tons of people being networked together. You're going to get bad actors, and It's a whack-a-mole problem, right? This was a different order of magnitude because it became a game that people were playing. And, Elon Musk has said for a very long time that he is this free speech maximalist. Now, he doesn't practice that in his actual running of X. But there was this feeling, as there is always when there are these trolls and harassers on the platform, that this is just, if you're going to make a free speech omelet, you're going to have to break some eggs, right? This is just what it looks like in practice. Mm-hmm. That is fundamentally not the case. That argument is actually wrong, because as you saw with this, when people were trying to call out this behavior, when people were trying to flag politicians or other tech companies who could pressure Elon Musk or Elon Musk himself, there was an army of trolls who are using this feature to silence women, to basically bully them off the platform. So this is a prime example of the ways where if you don't have any guardrails or guidelines for content moderation, what you're actually doing is restricting speech. You are chilling other speech from happening because the trolls and the bullies have so much power.
Several countries have decided to push back on what happened over these couple of weeks. Indonesia, Malaysia, they've suspended the AI bot. Australia, Canada, France, Malaysia, UK have kind of investigated the creation of all of these sexualized deepfake images. California is looking at an investigation whether or not the Grok bot basically violated the state laws by facilitating the creation of non-consensual sexual images. And I wonder, are any of these things going to be enough of a consequence for Elon Musk or Grok to change the way that they roll out product features?
The bans are, interesting, right? People can obviously get around them with VPNs or things like that.
Yeah.
I think that when it comes to legislation in the government or people, like California looking into this, I think what is important in this sense is that people in power or who can put pressure on these companies care enough to look into it, to threaten that action, right? There needs to be some kind of feeling of consequences, because what's happened right now is, and I wrote this in the piece, this feeling of this culture of impunity, this crisis of impunity right now in the second Trump administration, where Donald Trump sort of sets the standard for how a lot of different institutions and politicians and executives and people with power can behave. And there is this feeling that there are no consequences. There's too much going on. There's too much chaos. The zone is so flooded that basically if you can just hang on and not apologize and just move forward, it will get buried by the next avalanche of bad news or outrage or what have you. And you can just kind of keep going and making money and doing the thing that you wanted to do. And I think what the reason I wrote this piece, the reason I'm so mad about this, the reason why I do think that it's great that, you know, some lawmakers are looking into this, is that this was such an egregious example of somebody running a company so recklessly and hurting all these vulnerable people, that I think this is a moment for us to kind of freeze on something like this and say, people need to suffer some kind of consequences for this. There are young children who were sexually harassed, whose image, you know, was used against their will in a sexual manner. And we can't just look away from that. We can't just say, oh, you know, it's a bug. This is something that we just have to deal with in the age of generative AI. And if we, as a society, do give up and just let them run roughshod, I think that we've crossed some kind of line, and I don't think we can claw it back. We can't. We basically then have said we've ceded these platforms to chaos.
A statement from Elon said, "I'm not aware of any naked underage images generated by Grok, literally zero. When asked to generate images, it will refuse to produce anything illegal, as the operating principle for Grok is to obey the laws of any given country or state. There may be times when adversarial hacking of Grok prompts does something unexpected. If that happens, we fix the bug immediately." Have they fixed all of these bugs?
Well, to be fair to X, they have fixed plenty to try to, you know, respond to some of this outrage as it has really reached a fever pitch. But the idea that Musk is separating in his mind this idea of like what Grok is generating versus what it's generating when it's being adversarially hacked, you can't do that as the owner of a piece of technology, because there is no technology that reaches a certain level of prominence that isn't adversarially hacked. This is the table stakes of creating a technology that you deploy out to millions of people, is that you have to play this game of whack-a-mole. You have to have teams of people who are willing to protect the users from people who are going to try to break the technology.
At the same time that this is happening or was happening, the Pentagon announced that Grok would be integrated on, quote, every unclassified and classified network throughout the Pentagon systems. Should we be concerned on a structural level that a software, let's just look at it as a software company, rolls out something to the public that's so bad, and at the same time, it's going to have access to every military secret that we have?
I don't look at it and say Grok is bad, right? Grok is you know, a bully, or Grok is a sexual deviant or something like that. It's all about the parameters. It's all about what the people who are programming these models, like the guardrails that they're instituting, the ways that they are being, you know, prompted behind the scenes to respond, right? And Grok is being prompted to respond in a racier manner, in a sort of no holds barred, no censorship manner. And so my worry is with the people who are in charge of that company. They are making these decisions. Elon Musk, other people at XAI are making these decisions to have their large language model behave in a very specific way. And that is extremely concerning when you start thinking about the ways that, you know, it could be integrated with the Pentagon.
There is legislation in the United States. Congress has this bipartisan Take It Down Act, right? And that was passed in May of last year. It kind of gives the platforms until May of this 2026, where they have to establish some sort of a notice and a takedown procedure. Do you think that this type of legislation will work? I mean, can it keep up with how fast technology is evolving?
Bluntly, I don't think it can. I think some of that too is the craven nature of some of our politicians, some of our lawmakers. You know, Ted Cruz is a co-sponsor of that bill. He initially, when this Grok scandal was first, you know, kicking off, said this is unacceptable, mentioned his own sponsorship of the bill, and then last week he was he posted a photo on Twitter of him with his arm around Elon Musk saying, "It's always great to see this guy." I mean, I think that says everything right there, right? Not only is Congress and legislation up against, as you said, like this pace, this speed of how these things happen, right? You know, as soon as people feel like they may have a handle on, you know, the Web 2.0 version of social media, then you layer in generative AI on top of that, right? And you have, you know, this idea that we were just talking about of like, what is the liability there? Did these companies generate this? Should they be held liable for what, you know, for what their users do with the generative AI tools that they build? You have all of these concerns and the fact that the technology is racing ahead of, you know, what the lawmakers, you know, can imagine and what the law can do. But also you just have this crisis of impunity, as I said, right? If one of the co-sponsors of the bill feels totally valid posting on Elon Musk's social media platform, basically, you know, touting his friendship with the guy who did not stop this thing from happening, this scandal, this crisis from happening. What are we doing here?
You know, when you broaden this out, there was a UK-based nonprofit called the Internet Watch Foundation. And in 2024, they found 13 instances of AI-generated videos of child sex abuse. In 2025, they found 3,440. And that's before any of the stuff with Grok that we're talking about. If this trajectory continues, I just wonder in 26 or 27, what percentage of what's generated by AI goes from, oh, look, you know, it's funny cat videos, to this stuff.
The truth is it's going to go up if we let it. That number is going to go up if, as a society, as a, you know, culture in places like Silicon Valley, the people who make these tools, the politicians, the watchdogs, etc., the press, everyone, if we allow it to, if we let these instances slip by and people don't lose their jobs or these companies don't face significant repercussions, and I'm not talking about slap on the wrist fine, it's going to go up. And it's going to go up in a way that is incredibly concerning if you are a person with a conscience or a parent or, you know, like truly anyone who has a sense of moral compass, because I've been in these communities to report on them at great like psychological turmoil to myself and watched these anonymous people bring up innocent photos taken from Instagram and say, hey, can you put this person in this thing? A daughter, a son, a younger person, what have you. It's disgusting. It's despicable. And if we do not draw the reddest of red lines around this AI-generated non-consensual sex abuse material of minors, but also just, you know, people of age, if we do not culturally just say, this is poison, this is cancerous, this needs to be excised, this behavior needs to be treated the same way we treat that material when it's not AI generated and it's out in the world. If we don't do something about that, that number is going to go up. And real people are going to be devastated by that. And I just think that those are the stakes of this entire scandal.
Staff writer at The Atlantic, Charlie Warzel, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, as climate change alters weather patterns and landscapes, it's also reshaping the geopolitical stakes in places where resources were once hard to reach, like the Arctic. American and Danish officials are expected to meet amid President Trump's threats to take over Greenland, though Greenland itself has made it clear it rejects the idea.
Greenland does not want to be owned by the USA. Greenland does not want to be governed by the USA. Greenland will not be a part of the USA. We choose the Greenland we know today, which is part of the Kingdom of Denmark. Now we are faced with a geopolitical crisis, and if we have to choose between the USA and Denmark, here and now, we choose Denmark.
The U.S. focus on the mineral-rich territory signals a growing interest in the changing region, including from other global superpowers like Russia and China. Journalist Kenneth Rosen speaks to Walter Isaacson about his new book on the topic and how national security could transform in the Arctic.
Thank you, Biana and Ken Rosen. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Walter.
You have this great new book out, Polar War, which is actually quite chilling in many ways, reading about you in the far north. But tell me, let's start with, to what effect is climate change having on the geography of the far north of the Arctic?
It's really changing everything in the circumpolar north. What once was significant sea ice that covered the Arctic Ocean at the North Pole during the summer is now dissipating and melting over the summers to the point where scientists believe by 2030 or so that sea will be completely ice-free. That's probably the most dramatic effect we're seeing, but with the receding of that ice along the coastlines of, say, Alaska and the Barents Sea and elsewhere in the Arctic Ocean, the communities that live along the shorelines are now facing no more protection from the ice, protection from typhoons and other weather events that once were trapped underneath ice or kept at bay because of the ice.
And your book's mainly about the struggle for power, all the spies being involved. So tell me how what you just said affects national security of the United States.
So as that ice melts and permafrost thaws, one of the main concerns, one of the driving components of a power competition in the high north is the opening of sea channels, commercial seaways, principally above Russia's land border with the Arctic, what they're calling the Northern Sea Route. It's a significant change because ships coming from East Asia to Europe would sever about 10 to 12 days off their journey. A huge impact on shipping and the cost of shipping across what was the Suez Canal and could now be a potential alternative.
So this week, of course, the big news is that Secretary of State Rubio is going to negotiate. Tell me about that trip and what you think they're really trying to achieve there.
Well, as you know, Walter, it came on the heels of President Trump stating after attacking Venezuela and unseating Maduro that he wanted Greenland again, which was not something that he has not said before. He said it several times, both in his first presidency and now the second term. And it seems as though he was considering a military option, but now is potentially looking at a diplomatic option. He's gone as far as saying that he would pay for Greenland. And of course, Walter, having read the book, you know that the U.S. has a long history of wanting Greenland and trying to acquire it or having some control over it during World War II. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that a president would want it, but to do it in such a bellicose way is a little troublesome when, as we mentioned earlier, the region's in a strange state of affairs already given climate change.
Well, yeah, you mentioned that we've had a long history of this. I didn't realize that right at the end of the Civil War in 1867, we're buying Alaska, which is somewhat of an analogy to this. And we're also thinking, let's also buy Greenland. So explain how long we've been thinking about this.
Well, Secretary Seward, President Lincoln's Secretary of State, was the one who wanted to buy what a lot of people in Congress, a lot of congressional members thought was an icebox, right? It would just be this place that would end up giving nothing to the U.S., just be this total tear on resources and a strain on the economy, but eventually turned out to be a boon for the U.S., as we know, with the Trans-Alaska Pipeline.
And you're talking about Alaska, yeah, right.
It's just Alaska. And so after that, they were considering, the Congress and the president were considering, well, maybe we shouldn't have to fight for a lot of the territory that we won. Maybe we could actually go out and purchase it. They had considered buying Canada as the UK was rolling back its territories overseas. And one of those other potential parcels of land was Greenland, and turned out to be a much needed part of our national defense during World War II.
And President Truman, I think, was thinking of offering $100 million, I read.
Yeah, now they're talking about, $5 billion or just a couple $1 trillion for Greenland. And it's almost a moot point because the Greenlanders have said, the Inuit people of Greenland have said time and again that they're not for sale. They want to do business. They certainly want to open up their economy. They're looking at expanding their tourism and fishery industries. But an outright takeover, whether it be through cash or arms, is not quite beneficial to their interests, and they know that.
So if there's not going to be an outright sale, what could there be that makes some sense? Is there anything that the Trump administration could get other than what we already have in our treaties, which is military bases?
I think it's an expansion on what we already have. I think that the Trump administration hasn't outlined clearly that the agreements we maintain with Denmark is that we can build more bases, that we can expand our military footprint there, that we can get leases for mines, and that we can open up the mining industry if we want. Now, that's a whole different conversation about the implausibility of operating mines in the high north. But we already have a really great relationship. We, being the Americans, have a great relationship with Denmark that could foster exactly the things that President Trump is talking about without the excess need of taking over another country or shelling out $500 billion a year to sustain that economy, which is what Denmark already does.
Well, wait, you said that it would be impractical, perhaps, to do a whole lot of rare earth and other mining in the high north. Why is that? Is the infrastructure impossible?
Well, the infrastructure is impossible because there's the short seasons, right? It's dark for all of winter. The shoulder season of summer is 4 or 5 months where you can get boats in and equipment in, and that is long before you even build out roads or the infrastructure needed for mining. I mean, Walter, Greenland is 2.5 times the size of Texas, and it has 100 miles of roads. So there would be a lot of development that needs to go into it. There's already difficulties in Alaska and northern Canada when it comes to building out military bases or rare earth mines, and looking down at the longevity of such a place, you need to look at 25, 50 years rather than the normal 5, 10, 15 years of when a mine's going to be profitable. So there's a lot more that goes into it, and there's got to be a lot more investment over a longer period of time.
Let me read you a sentence from the book, which deals with Russia. You say Russia is leading the charge with more military bases in the Arctic, greater competency in cold weather operations, and a fleet of icebreakers that dwarfs the maritime Arctic fleet of every other nation. So is it inevitable that Russia has a huge military advantage throughout the Arctic?
They certainly have the positioning, and they have the equipment. Their icebreakers, somewhere north of 50 or so nuclear-powered icebreakers, have a lot more time in the water and are up there more and more frequently. Whether or not their military capabilities are up to snuff, up to a conflict, or up to readiness for an event in the high north is unclear, given what we saw in Venezuela with unmaintained surface-to-air missiles and other equipment. So they certainly.
And how does Ukraine, their involvement, affect their ability in the high north?
Well, one of the interesting notes that I found from traveling the north is that a lot of the drone strikes that were undertaken against Kyiv were initiated from the Kola Peninsula, which is where Russia keeps its nuclear armed forces and its bastion defense. So it remains a place of a launch pad for a lot of the military strikes in Ukraine, and it could be seen that would translate to perhaps a launch pad for strikes against Eastern or Western Europe or even the United States.
You talk about how the Russians are much better with icebreakers, which seems like an obvious tool you need for that region still. And, in this area, Bollinger Shipyard's built a whole lot of icebreakers, but they need to get the magnets and some of the rare earth from China in order to do it. Are we handicapped because of things like that?
I'm not sure. A lot of the issues with the shipbuilding was the fact that the U.S. Coast Guard continued to change the designs of the ships as they were being developed. These security cutters, these polar security cutters, which is a program long delayed 10 or more years and into 20 years now. And that's one of Trump's desires for Greenland, is to get those rare earth minerals that would ostensibly fuel some of the development of greater technology in the military. But I don't think that particularly pertains to the ships themselves, which is a whole nother mess and nightmare. Lack of funding, lack of Coast Guard enrollment, enlistment, and loss of the admiral leading the Coast Guard only when Trump took office in January of last year.
You talk about the ships we might need in order to defend parts of the Arctic, the ice-breaking ships and all. It would seem to me, especially having read your book, that this is a good region for drones as opposed to humans, whether it be drone ships, drone warfare. Is something happening along those lines?
That's a great point. We haven't seen a lot of development of these autonomous vehicles or autonomous aircraft in the area, in part because the guidance systems are so hampered by this change in magnetic north, by digital guidance versus actual guidance of, trying to navigate in a place where the compass is spinning nonstop. That's why Starlink has proven to be so invaluable in the region, because the U.S. doesn't have the satellite capabilities up in the high north, but Starlink does. So when I was traveling with the U.S. Coast Guard in the Arctic Ocean just north of Norway, they were in love with the fact that they finally had Starlink for the first time, and they were testing it out for the rest of the fleet, for the rest of the Coast Guard, to see if it would work up there. So things like that, satellite imagery and more satellite coverage of the high north is where they are looking.
And what about those technologies, Starlink, other satellite technologies? How would new technologies help solve this? And to what extent is there a counter to that, all the spies and the jamming that you talk about in the book?
Right. So an over-reliance on technology is definitely a hindrance, right? But if we can develop more satellites in the region, then we have better communications. The alternative to that is, for what I saw in Ukraine, and also while reporting in Ukraine, what I saw in the high north, is that going back to simpler, less technologically reliant tools is what's going to save you in the Arctic. More and more battalions in the Swedish Armed Forces are using land cables or telegram cables to connect radio posts rather than use actual radio signals, because of the predilection for the plastics to break in the cold weather, for the lines to go down in a superstorm or the like. So going back to the simplicity of knowing the Arctic and living in the Arctic and having the tools that are just enough to get you by are probably sometimes more better than in excess in technology, new drones which could ice over if they fly into the wrong cloud and then collapse.
Well, one of the things you describe is how our bases are languishing, that even the old technology is falling apart.
So specifically to the Pacific Space Base in northern Greenland, the runways are buckling every summer as the permafrost thaws. Some of the buildings are outdated and are collapsing with the permafrost thawing. And some of the barracks for the people who live there, the few people who live there, are not even Wi-Fi equipped. They were just living in a sort of tent in the north without the amenities of a modern life. And even in Alaska, this was the case, with the fences that were surrounding Eielson Air Force Base becoming exposed to melting or thawing permafrost and melting ice, so that someone could even crawl underneath a chain link fence now and get access to the base.
When you look at China, it's got no border on the Arctic, but they're calling themselves a near-Arctic nation. And of course, what you described makes sense to me suddenly, which is they could get whole new routes for their entire supply chain and trading system if they do it. What are China's intentions in the Arctic?
It wants to develop what it's calling the Polar Silk Road, also along that northern sea route, to get a stake in the Arctic. Right now, the Arctic Council, the primary governing body in the high north, is composed of 8 nations, and China is just an observer state. So as long as it can keep pushing its way into the north and find reasons to support Russia and its endeavors, it can also become a player up there. But ever since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as we were mentioning in Svalbard, Turkey signed on to the Svalbard Treaty. All these other nations are claiming near Arctic status and wanting to have a piece of what was traditionally just the littoral states and then a few others. So a lot of different nations are making headway. India's making headway in saying, we are an Arctic nation because climate change affects us all. There's a valid argument there, but as far as cooperation in the high north, search and rescue, fisheries inspections, that has largely been retained by the 8 Arctic powers, and a lot of them don't want to lose that.
Well, you say that China is trying to create, I love the phrase, an Arctic Silk Road through there. It was just a few months ago, right, that they did the first route up there. So they seem to have much more of a claim than any of these other nations talking about being part of the near Arctic. Well,
it's a catch-22, right? We let China steam across this northern sea route, and actually South Korea just announced that it was planning on doing one of these routes in the coming months from East Asia to Rotterdam. The problem is that Western nations can't undertake it because of sanctions, and they'd have to face permits given by Russia in order to even transit that area, or face military buzzing, as I mentioned in one of the chapters of the book. So while we could potentially have American or Western companies transit that route, the cost of insurance premiums is really high. You'd have to somehow evade sanctions and pay Russia for the sponsorship to be able to go through that route. And you'd have to have the vessels in order to be able to navigate safely were ice to appear and stop the vessel in its tracks. So it's something that's possible, I think, but it's also hard to undertake when we're also sanctioning the country that is overseeing that very route.
At the end of the Cold War, we kind of thought that the Arctic, in some ways, could be a great place of international cooperation. What happened then, and is there any way we could get back to something like that?
Right. Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev called it a zone of peace, right? And now, from the reporting that I did over the last 2.5, 3 years, it's become something of a zone of war. And what we can do to keep it together, to keep that cooperation ongoing, it's very hard to say, Walter. I mean, just with all the recent rhetoric coming out of Washington, I think a lot of people in Denmark and the Scandinavian nations, the Arctic nations more broadly, are worried about the next 2 weeks, let alone scientific cooperation. They're worried about their own borders and their own populations. And I think we're moving much, much farther away from that conversation of how do we get back to peace and cooperation, and more toward a conversation of, do we need a different framework for managing our international relations up there?
If we wanted to get back to an era of peace and cooperation, and you could have 2 minutes with Secretary Rubio as he goes on this trip, what would you advise him?
I would tell Secretary Rubio that we are stronger together in the North, and that it's a long-known facility of living in the cold regions, that you will come to rely on your neighbor and your neighbor will come to rely on you. No matter what kind of relationship you've had, it will always come down to who you know and how well you cooperate together. We have a lot of assets in the high north, and we need to strengthen them, not deteriorate the cooperative mechanisms that we do have, in the hopes of getting something that isn't there yet.
Ken Rosen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Walter.